Sign it, or I'll make sure you never see this child not one single day of her life." Garrett Hollis said it without blinking, without flinching, his hand pressed flat against the divorce papers, like he was holding down something that might escape. His mother raised a champagne glass behind him. 8 months pregnant. Celeste looked from the papers to her husband's face and realized the man she had loved for 5 years had never existed at all. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what Garrett didn't know about his wife was about to cost him everything. It started with a piece of paper. Not the divorce papers, those came later. It started with something smaller, something ordinary, the kind of thing that gets tucked into a coat pocket and forgotten. A hotel receipt. Folded, once slightly crumpled at the corner, printed on that thin thermal paper that fades if you leave it in the sun too long. Celeste Mercer found it on a Tuesday morning in October when she reached into her husband's winter coat to hang it up because Garrett had dropped it on the back of the dining chair again, the way he always did, the way she had always quietly fixed without saying a word. She almost didn't look at it. That was the thing she kept coming back to afterward in the long hours when the apartment was quiet and Eleanor was asleep against her ribs, and the city hummed outside the window like it had no idea what had happened inside these walls. She almost just set it on the counter. She almost folded it smaller and tucked it into the trash. But something, a reflex, a whisper, a part of her that had been paying attention even when the rest of her was too tired to made her open it. The Park Meridian Hotel, Boston, Massachusetts, October 14th, room service for 2, filet mignon twice, a bottle of Chateau Margaux 2017, creme brulee, strawberries, $642. Celeste stood in the hallway of her own apartment with her husband's coat in one hand and that receipt in the other, and she did the only thing her brain could manage in that moment. She counted backward. October 14th. Garrett had told her he was in Chicago. She remembered it clearly because she'd had a prenatal appointment that day, the 34-week check, and she had gone alone because he said the flight was non-negotiable, the client was non-negotiable, and she had nodded and told him it was fine, and driven herself to the doctor, and sat in the waiting room surrounded by couples holding hands and looking at ultrasound images together, and she had told herself it was fine. It was not fine. He had not been in Chicago. She set the coat down on the chair where he always left it. She folded the receipt and put it in the pocket of her cardigan against her chest, close to where her heart had just cracked clean through, and then she walked to the kitchen and filled a glass of water and drank it slowly because she was 8 months pregnant and her daughter was pressing against her lungs and she needed to breathe. She needed to think. The thing about Celeste Mercer, and this was something very few people understood about her because she had spent years making herself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook, was that she was not a woman who fell apart quickly. She had learned early from a man who built empires and raised her alone after her mother died that the first thing you did when the ground shifted beneath you was not scream. You stood still. You assessed. You figured out what was real and what was theater, and then you decided what to do next. So she stood at the kitchen counter of the apartment she had chosen and decorated and made into a home, and she was very, very still. She thought about Chicago. She thought about all the other trips, the one to Seattle in August, the one to Dallas in June, the weekend conference in New York that had stretched from 2 days to 4. She thought about the phone calls that ended when she walked into the room, the texts he minimized before she could see the screen, the slow and steady way he had stopped looking at her, the way he used to sometime around the beginning of the year. She had attributed it to stress, to the pregnancy, to the natural way that early love settles into something quieter. She had been wrong. She heard his key in the door at 6:15. Garrett Hollis was a handsome man in the way that certain men are handsome deliberately carefully, like it was a tool he'd learned to sharpen. Tall, with dark hair that he kept just slightly longer than professional, a jaw that photographs well, and the particular confidence of someone who had never in his adult life been told no by someone he considered important. He had married Celeste 3 years ago in a small ceremony that his mother had declared insufficient and his colleagues had declared surprising, and for about 14 months, Celeste had genuinely believed they were building something real. He came in, dropped his bag, reached for the coat on the chair. She watched him from the kitchen doorway. "How is the office?" she asked. "Fine." He shrugged the coat on. Boring. Is there dinner? There's pasta on the stove. I'm not really hungry. He checked his phone. I might go back out. Marcus wants to grab a drink. Garrett. Something in her voice made him look up. Not the word he'd heard his name 10,000 times, but the quality of it, the stillness beneath it. What? She held out the receipt. He looked at it. He looked at her. And in the space between those two things, in that single second where his face did something complicated and involuntary before he could smooth it over, Celeste saw everything she needed to see. That's from the dry cleaning, he said. It's a hotel receipt. I can explain that. I know what it is, Garrett. Her voice was calm, remarkably calm even to her own ears. I know what date it is. I know where you told me you were. I need you to tell me the truth right now because I'm 8 months pregnant and I have been sitting with this for the last 4 hours and I deserve the truth. He put his phone in his pocket. He looked at the ceiling briefly, that particular gesture of a man calculating how much he can still get away with. Then he looked at her. It's not what you think, he said. Tell me what it is then. It was a work thing, a client dinner that went long and it made more sense to stay over. Room service for 2, she said. 642, filet mignon, twice. He was quiet. A bottle of wine, strawberries. She watched his face. Who was with you? He didn't answer. Who was with you, Garrett? Celeste. Say her name. The silence stretched between them like something being pulled to its breaking point. Celeste pressed her hand against her abdomen, where Eleanor was shifting restless, as if she could feel the tension in the room, even through the wall of her mother's body. Blythe, he said finally, quietly, like he was giving something up. Blythe Ashford. Celeste knew the name. She'd heard it in passing a colleague he'd said someone from the third-floor team. She had a vague image of a woman at a company holiday party 2 years ago, sleek, polished, the kind of woman who exists in every room, as if the room was built around her. Celeste had shaken her hand, had made small talk, had thought nothing of it. How long? Celeste asked. That's not an how long, Garrett. He looked at the floor. 8 months. 8 months. The same length as her pregnancy. She had spent 8 months carrying his child, going to prenatal appointments alone, reading books about labor and newborns and what to expect in the 4th trimester, making decisions about hospital bags and nursery colors and middle names. And for all 8 of those months, he had been somewhere else entirely. She didn't cry. She wanted to, in the way that your body sometimes registers grief before your mind has finished processing it. But she didn't. She pressed her feet into the floor and kept her breathing even and said, I'd like you to leave tonight. And that was when the door opened behind him. Dorothea Hollis had a key because Garrett had given her one without telling Celeste, which was a detail Celeste had discovered 6 months into the marriage and had never quite forgiven, though she had never quite said so. His mother was a precise woman, thin in the way of someone who had always considered hunger a form of discipline, with silver hair cut sharply at the jaw and eyes that evaluated everything with the same mild disdain. She was wearing a cream blazer. She was carrying a bottle of champagne. She was also carrying a manila envelope. I hope I'm not interrupting, Dorothea said in a tone that made it clear she had timed this perfectly. Celeste looked at the champagne. She looked at the envelope. She looked at Garrett. He did not look surprised. The realization landed quietly the way the worst things always do. Not a crash, a slow, heavy settling. He had known his mother was coming. He had planned this. The coat receipt was a coincidence. Her confronting him before Dorothea arrived was not part of their script, but the script itself had been written long before tonight. What is that? Celeste asked, though she already knew. Dorothea set the envelope on the table with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has played this moment out in her head many times. I think, she said, that it's time for everyone to be practical. Inside the envelope were 12 pages of pre-drafted divorce papers. Professional, thorough, the work of an expensive attorney. Celeste could see the firm's name at the top of the first page, Ashford, Mills and Crane. It took her a moment and then it clicked. Ashford. Of course. We had these prepared some time ago, Dorothea said. We simply wanted to be sure the timing was right. You prepared divorce papers, Celeste said slowly. While I was pregnant, we prepared for a transition. Dorothea said with the smoothness of someone who had decided that the right word for any ugly thing made it less ugly. Garrett deserves happiness, Celeste, and I think if you're honest with yourself, you've known for some time that this marriage wasn't. I'd like you to stop talking, Celeste said. Dorothea blinked. It was Celeste would think later possibly the first time anyone had said those words to Dorothea Hollis and been entirely, utterly serious. We're trying to handle this with dignity, Garrett said. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat, the same coat that had held the receipt, and produced a check. He held it out to her like it was a reasonable thing to do, like it was kind. 30,000. That's more than fair. You can get a place get settled before the baby comes. We're not trying to make this hard. Celeste looked at the check. She looked at her husband's hand holding it. She looked at his face. $30,000, she said. It's a generous offer. You are offering me $30,000, she said carefully, to walk away from my marriage, while I am 8 months pregnant with your daughter. The baby was never something we planned. She has a name, Celeste said. Her voice had dropped very low. Her name is Eleanor. Garrett pulled the check back slightly, as if reconsidering the gesture. We're not saying she isn't. We just think it would be cleaner if I disappeared, Celeste said. That's the word you used. Disappear. It's just an expression. Garrett. She looked at him steadily. Did you choose tonight, deliberately? Did you and your mother decide that this was the right moment when I am this far along? This close, when I am as physically and emotionally vulnerable as I am ever likely to be in my life to do this? Was that the plan? He didn't deny it. Dorothea stepped in. We thought it would be better to resolve this before the birth rather than after. Legal matters are always simpler. I would like, Celeste said very quietly, for both of you to give me a moment. She picked up the envelope. She took the 12 pages of divorce papers into her hands, and she went to the kitchen table, the table she had picked out from a little shop in Brooklyn 18 months ago. The table where she had eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners and had long conversations and sat up late, sometimes thinking about what kind of mother she wanted to be, and she sat down and she started reading. She read every word. This was not what Garrett had expected. She could feel him watching her from across the room, unsettled by her stillness. Dorothea had settled onto the couch with a posture of determined patience. Neither of them spoke. The apartment was so quiet that Celeste could hear the clock above the refrigerator and the faint hum of the city and her own breathing, which she was keeping deliberately slow. The terms were as bad as she'd expected, worse in some ways. The prenuptial agreement Garrett had asked her to sign 18 months before their wedding, which she had reviewed only briefly, trusting him, or trusting the version of him she'd believed in, had been written with meticulous care to protect his assets and minimize hers. Her creative work, the illustrations and design projects she'd spent years building, had been categorized in ambiguous language. The custody language was vague in ways that were not accidental. She read it twice. Page 9 was particularly interesting. It outlined a clause she hadn't noticed before, a right of first refusal on certain intellectual properties developed during the marriage, tied to language that could be interpreted by an aggressive attorney to include her independent design portfolio work she had built entirely on her own long before she met Garrett Hollis. She turned to page 9 a third time. You had an attorney write this, she said without looking up. Of course, Dorothea said. Your attorney, I assume. A very good one. Celeste set page 9 down and moved to page 10. The custody arrangement on page 7. Primary physical custody to the father. We felt that made the most sense given your... My what? Dorothea paused. Your situation. My situation, Celeste repeated. You mean my pregnancy? We mean the instability. I am a grown woman with a stable career, my own savings, and no history of anything that would suggest I am unfit to raise my child. Celeste looked up then. Is that what you were going to say? That my situation makes me unfit? Garrett shifted. We just thought. No, she said. I don't think you did think. I don't think either of you thought very hard about who you were sitting across from. She turned back to the papers. She could feel Garrett's frustration building from across the room. This was not the version of this conversation he had rehearsed. He had expected tears, probably. Shock. Capitulation. He had expected a woman so wounded and frightened that she would reach for any lifeline, even a bad one. That was the Celeste he thought he'd married, quiet, grateful, small. He had made a significant error in judgment. Celeste had spent 5 years making herself small. She had done it intentionally carefully because she had wanted to be loved as herself and not as her father's daughter, not as the heir to something vast and consequential, not as the name Harrison Mercer printed across hospital wings and technology campuses and charitable foundations across 3 continents. She had moved to New York at 24 with a portfolio and a pseudonym and a fierce, private need to prove that she was more than who she'd been born to be. She had built a design career, a reputation, a life. She had met Garrett at a gallery opening and loved him in the uncomplicated way she'd always wanted to love someone, without the weight of money and legacy and expectation pressing down on every moment. She had not told him who her father was, not because she was ashamed she was not ashamed, but because she had wanted just once for love to be the only thing in the room. It had cost her. She could see that now with the clarity of hindsight. By keeping her identity private, she had stripped herself of the protection it carried. Garrett and his mother had looked at her and seen a woman of modest means and quiet ambitions, someone without powerful allies, someone alone. They had made their calculations accordingly. Those calculations were about to be revisited. She finished reading page 12. She set the papers down on the table, aligned them neatly. She folded her hands over them. "I'm not signing this tonight," she said. Garrett took a step forward. "Celeste, I'm not signing anything tonight or tomorrow or without my own legal representation." She met his eyes. "You had months to prepare this. You will give me time to respond to it." "We'd hoped to keep this simple," Dorothea said. "I'm sure you did. The longer you delay, the more complicated this becomes." Complicated for whom? Dorothea set down her champagne glass she had been drinking while Celeste read, which Celeste had noted, and filed away. "For your child, frankly. The sooner this is resolved, the sooner everyone can move forward." "You don't get to invoke my daughter's well-being," Celeste said very quietly, "to pressure me into signing documents I've had 20 minutes to review." The room was silent. Garrett pulled out his phone. She watched him type something. He was calm again now, having made some internal adjustment, pivoting to a strategy she hadn't anticipated. "I've asked a colleague to come by, just to answer any questions you have about the paperwork, make sure everything is clear." "Cancel that," she said. "Celeste." "I said cancel it, Garrett." She stood slowly with the careful deliberateness of a woman 8 months pregnant, navigating a body that no longer felt entirely her own. "I'm going to take these papers, and I'm going to have my own attorney review them. Until then, you will give me this apartment, and you will not contact me through anyone other than legal channels." Garrett's jaw tightened. "You're not in a position to make demands." "I'm in every position to make demands," she said. "I am your wife. I am carrying your daughter, and I have rights, many of them." She picked up the envelope. "You chose tonight because you thought I was at my most vulnerable. You should have chosen differently." Dorothea stood as well. She had the expression of a woman recalibrating. "You're being irrational. Emotions are running high, that's understandable. But the practical reality is that you have no—" "My father is on his way," Celeste said. The words fell into the room like something dropped from a great height. Both of them looked at her. "You called your father," Garrett said. "He's been in the city since yesterday," she said, which was true. She had texted Harrison from the kitchen while the pasta cooled on the stove and the receipt sat in her cardigan pocket, and she had typed 6 words, "I need you, come tonight." And he had replied within 2 minutes in the way he always replied to the few things she asked him for, "Already on my way." "Harrison," Dorothea said slowly. "Your father's name is Harrison." "Harrison Mercer," Celeste said. And she watched Dorothea Hollis's face do something extraordinary that shifted that sudden reordering of everything she thought she understood about the woman standing across from her. The name Harrison Mercer was not a name you heard without recognizing it. It was the kind of name that opened rooms, that changed conversations, that rewrote in an instant the entire ledger of who had power and who did not. Garrett had gone very still. "You're," he started. "His daughter," she said. "Yes." She tucked the envelope under her arm. Her heart was hammering, and Eleanor was pushing hard against her side, and her hands, she realized distantly, were trembling slightly, but her voice was not. Her voice was absolutely steady. "I have been Harrison Mercer's daughter for 30 years, she said. "I chose not to tell you because I wanted something real, because I wanted to be loved as myself, because I genuinely believed that what we had was worth protecting." She looked at him, really looked at him, at the face she had woken up next to for 3 years, and she let herself feel for one full moment the enormity of what she was losing before she put it somewhere safe and closed the door on it. "I think you should both sit down," she said. "He'll be here in 12 minutes. She turned and walked toward the hallway. Behind her, she heard Dorothea say very quietly to her son, "How did you not know?" And Garrett said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The clock above the refrigerator read 7:48. 12 minutes. That was what Celeste had said. 12 minutes until Harrison Mercer walked through that door, and in the silence that followed her words, the entire apartment seemed to contract around those two people still standing in the living room, as if the walls themselves had heard the name and pulled inward. Garrett moved first. He crossed the room in 3 steps and put himself between Celeste and the hallway, and his voice had changed completely. The cold, rehearsed calm was gone, replaced by something rawer and faster. "You need to think very carefully about what you're doing right now," he said. "I have been thinking carefully," she said, "for the last 4 hours. If your father comes in here and this turns into something, if this gets complicated, I will make this custody fight the ugliest thing you have ever seen in your life." She looked at him. He was close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the slight dilation of panic in his eyes. He had not been prepared for this. Neither of them had. And there was something almost clarifying about watching Garrett Hollis frightened. It stripped away the performance, the tailored confidence, the practiced ease that had made her fall for him in the first place, and left behind someone smaller than she remembered. "You just threatened me," she said. "I'm being honest with you. You threatened your pregnant wife," she said steadily, "with a custody war, while your mother is sitting on my couch with a champagne bottle." She tilted her head slightly. "Say that out loud again and listen to what it sounds like." He stepped back. Not much, but enough. Dorothea stood up from the couch, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its earlier ease. "Garrett, that's enough." She looked at Celeste with the expression of a woman rapidly revising her position. "Celeste, I want to be very clear that we came here tonight in good faith." "You came here with pre-drafted divorce papers and champagne," Celeste said. "That is not good faith. That is a celebration." The champagne was premature. "The champagne was honest," Celeste said. "It's the only honest thing in this room." She moved past Garrett to the kitchen and set the envelope on the counter. Her back was to both of them now, and she used that moment, just 3 seconds, just long enough to press her palm flat against the counter and breathe. Eleanor shifted inside her, a slow roll that felt deliberate and grounding, as if her daughter was reminding her of exactly what this was for. She straightened. She turned back around. Garrett was on his phone. "Who are you calling?" she asked. "My attorney." "It's 7:49 on a Tuesday night." He answers. Garrett pressed the phone to his ear and turned slightly away. "Richard, yes, I need you to yes tonight, as soon as possible." A pause. "There have been developments." Developments. That was one word for it. Dorothea had moved toward the window. Celeste watched her without making it obvious she was watching a habit she had cultivated over years of quiet observation, of being the person in the room that everyone underestimated. Dorothea was recalculating. You could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way her fingers moved against the stem of the champagne glass she was still holding. She was running through everything she knew about Harrison Mercer, and everything she thought she'd known about Celeste, and trying to reconcile those two things into a picture that made sense. It didn't make sense. That was the point. Celeste had known from the day she married Garrett Hollis that she was taking a risk. Not a blind one, she was not a careless woman, but a considered one. She had told herself that love required some measure of faith, and that keeping her identity private was a choice she was entitled to make, and that if the marriage was good and real and solid, it would not matter who her father was. The marriage had not been good and real and solid. She wondered now as she stood in her own kitchen waiting for the man who had raised her to arrive, whether she had known that on some level for longer than she wanted to admit. Whether the quiet way she had maintained her financial independence, her own accounts, her own clients, her carefully preserved pseudonym had been practicality or foresight or something closer to preparation. It didn't matter now. What mattered was the next 11 minutes. Garrett hung up. "Richard's coming." "I don't think that changes anything," she said. "It changes the conversation you're planning to have with your father." "My father is not coming to have a conversation with you," she said. "He's coming because I asked him to, because I needed someone in my corner tonight." She looked at him evenly. "You have your mother, I have mine." It was a strange thing to say she did not have. Her mother had not had her mother since she was 9 years old, and they both knew it. But the weight of it landed the way she intended, and Garrett's expression flickered with something that might, in another version of this man, have been shame. 7:53, 7 minutes. Dorothea set down the champagne glass. "I think," she said carefully, "that it would be in everyone's interest to approach this evening with some degree of composure. Whatever the circumstances of your parentage, Celeste, the underlying situation hasn't changed. This marriage has broken down. The most practical path forward. Dorothea." Celeste said her name the way you say a door is closed, not unkindly, simply as a fact. "I have sat across from you for 3 years of dinners and holidays and Sunday afternoons. I have listened to you, deferred to you, adjusted myself to fit into the shape of what you wanted your son's wife to be. I was patient with you. I was gracious with you. I did all of that because I believed in this family." She paused. "So please understand that when I say I am not interested in your advice right now, I mean it with everything I have." Dorothea blinked. Garrett made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff. "She has a point, Mom." "Don't," Celeste said sharply. "Don't do that. Don't pretend we're on the same side because you're nervous." Garrett looked stung. "Good. 5 minutes." The air in the apartment had changed. Celeste could feel it, that particular tension that accumulates in a room when people are waiting for something they cannot control. Garrett paced twice and stopped. Dorothea stood very still near the window. Celeste sat down at the kitchen table because her lower back had been aching since 6 o'clock, and she was not going to stand for 5 minutes out of pride when she had an 8-pound baby sitting on her spine. She set her hands flat on the table. She looked at her wedding ring. It was a beautiful ring, a simple oval diamond on a plain gold band, chosen because she had told Garrett she preferred something that felt like it was meant to last rather than meant to impress. She had meant that as a value statement. In retrospect, she was not sure he had understood what she was saying. "Celeste," Garrett said. He had come to stand at the edge of the kitchen. His voice was different again. Lower, the pacing gone, something almost genuine underneath it. "I need you to understand that this wasn't— I didn't plan this to hurt you." "You planned it while I was pregnant," she said, without looking up from her hands. "I know how that looks." "It looks like what it is." "I was going to tell you after the baby was born. I thought it would be cleaner." She looked up then. "Cleaner," she repeated. "Less emotional, less— You were going to let me go through labor and delivery and the first days of my child's life thinking I had a husband," she said. "And then you were going to tell me." He didn't answer. "Garrett, that is not clean. That is not kind. That is not any version of consideration for my well-being. That is you preserving your own comfort for as long as possible and then handing me a disaster to manage alone." Her voice remained even, which cost her more than he would ever know. "I want you to understand that I see exactly what this was. I am not confused. I am not being emotional in a way that is distorting my perception. I understand this with complete clarity." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you are," she said. "I think you're sorry it happened this way. I don't think you're sorry it happened." 3 minutes. Dorothea moved away from the window. She had made some internal decision. Celeste could see it the way her posture reorganized itself. Her chin came up slightly. I want to say something, Dorothea said, and I want you to hear it without, "He's here," Celeste said, because her phone had buzzed on the table and the message from Harrison said simply, "Lobby." The elevator in this building took about 90 seconds from the lobby to the 14th floor. Celeste knew this because she had timed it once absently the way you absorb small details about the places you live. 90 seconds. She stood up from the table. She went to the front door, she unlocked it and left it open, and came back to the kitchen and stood beside the counter. Garrett and Dorothea watched the open door. The elevator opened down the hall. She heard footsteps more than one set. Her father did not go places alone when he was going somewhere that required him to be her father, rather than Harrison Mercer, private person. He had people. She had always slightly hated that growing up the way he was. Never simply her dad, but always also himself, always the gravitational center of a small orbit of advisors and staff. Tonight she was grateful for it. Harrison Mercer came through the door first. He was 61, and he looked it in the way that men who have worked hard and cared deeply and lost sleep over real things look their age with substance rather than decay. He was not a tall man, but he had a quality of fullness of presence that made rooms feel arranged around him. His hair had gone fully white in the last 2 years. He was wearing a charcoal coat over a dark sweater, and his eyes went to Celeste first, and only sweeping her from face to hands to the envelope on the counter and back to her face, in the particular way of a parent reading their child's state of being in an instant. "You okay?" he said. Just that. "I'm okay," she said. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, carefully around her bulk, and her daughter, and her 4 hours of held-together composure, and for exactly 4 seconds, Celeste let herself be 9 years old and small and held by her father. 4 seconds. Then she stepped back. Behind Harrison came 2 men. Marcus Webb, his head of security, broad and quiet, who had taught Celeste to drive on a Sunday morning in an empty parking lot when Harrison was traveling, and who had once memorably located a college roommate's stolen bicycle through means he declined to specify. And beside Marcus, a woman in a gray blazer with reading glasses pushed up on her head, Stephanie Cho Harrison's legal counsel for the last 11 years, whom Celeste had met a dozen times at family dinners and charitable events, and who had the particular stillness of someone who had heard every version of every bad situation and was never surprised. Garrett looked at Stephanie. Something moved across his face. "Mr. Hollis," Harrison said. He had turned unhurriedly to look at his son-in-law. His voice was neutral in the way of someone choosing neutrality deliberately. "I think you and I should talk." "Mr. Mercer?" Garrett straightened slightly. He extended his hand. It was either very brave or very foolish. Harrison looked at it for a moment before shaking it briefly. "I'm glad you're here. I think Celeste has been—" "I'm not here for your assessment of my daughter," Harrison said, not unkindly, simply as a statement of fact. "I'm here because she asked me to come, and because I understand there are some legal documents that need to be looked at." Stephanie had already moved to the counter and was picking up the manila envelope. Dorothea, who had been standing very still since Harrison entered, said, "Mr. Mercer, I'm Dorothea Hollis, Garrett's mother." "I know who you are," Harrison said. He didn't offer anything else. Dorothea absorbed this and recalibrated. "I want to be clear that what happened tonight, the way this was handled that wasn't ideal, and I take some responsibility for the timing." "That's very forthcoming of you," Harrison said. His tone did not change. It was pleasant and impenetrable. He moved to the kitchen table and sat down across from where Celeste had been sitting, and he looked at his daughter. "Tell me what happened." So she told him. Briefly, plainly, without theatrical emphasis, the way he had taught her to communicate the things that mattered, just the facts in order clearly. The coat, the receipt, October 14th. Boston, 6:42 for 2, Blythe Ashford, 8 months. The papers, the check, $30,000, the word disappear. Harrison listened without interrupting. His expression did not change dramatically. He had the face of a man who had negotiated too many difficult tables to let his face become a liability. But something shifted in his eyes when she said $30,000, and something shifted harder when she said disappear, and by the time she finished, he was very, very still. "She's lying about the $30,000, Garrett said from across the room. The stillness intensified. "I beg your pardon," Harrison said. I offered her a settlement, a fair one. She's Richard. Garrett's phone buzzed, and he looked at the screen. My attorney is outside. He can wait, Harrison said. Garrett blinked. Your attorney can wait in the lobby, Harrison said. This is my daughter's home, and she has not invited him in. When she is ready to have that conversation, she will invite him in. Until then. He looked back at Celeste. You said he offered $30,000. I have the check, she said. It's on the counter. Stephanie had already found it without being asked. She held it up briefly, noted the amount, set it down. $30,000, Harrison said again softly, almost to himself. For my daughter, 8 months pregnant, to disappear. He looked at Garrett with an expression that Celeste had seen exactly once before in her life when she was 14, and a boy at her school had told her that she was only there because of her father's donations, and Harrison had gone very still in a way that meant something was about to change. What is it exactly that you think my daughter is worth, Mr. Hollis? Garrett opened his mouth. He closed it. Because I want to understand your thinking, Harrison continued. I want to understand the calculation. A woman with a 16-year design career, a recognizable body of work, a client list that any firm in this city would want. A woman who is 30 years old and has never asked anyone for anything she didn't earn. Your daughter. $30,000. Help me understand. It was a starting offer, Garrett said, and the weakness of it collapsed the moment he said it. A starting offer, Harrison repeated. For the woman carrying your child. Dorothea made a small sound that might have been an attempt to intervene. Harrison turned his attention to her with the same quiet focus. Mrs. Hollis, I understand you came here tonight with champagne. Dorothea did not answer. To celebrate, he said, the end of your son's marriage, while my daughter was sitting in this apartment trying to hold herself together. He looked at the champagne bottle on the counter. He looked back at Dorothea. I'm going to ask you to leave, he said. I want you to take your champagne, and I'd like you to leave this apartment because I am trying very hard right now to be a reasonable man, and your presence is making that difficult. Dorothea stood up very straight. This is my daughter's home, Harrison said. She is the one who chose it. She is the one who decorated it. She is the one who has lived in it. And she is the one who asked me to come here tonight, which means for tonight I am making decisions about who is in it. A long silence. Then Dorothea Hollis picked up her coat. She picked up the champagne bottle, whether out of instinct or some determination not to leave it, and she walked to the front door. She paused there and looked at Garrett. He didn't move to follow her. She left. The door clicked shut behind her, and the room reorganized itself around her absence. Garrett looked at his father-in-law. He looked at Marcus, who was standing near the door with the stillness of a man who has learned not to take up space unless asked to. He looked at Stephanie, who was reading through the divorce papers with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and the focused silence of someone identifying problems. Sit down, Garrett, Celeste said. He sat. Stephanie looked up from the papers. She addressed Celeste rather than Garrett, which was its own kind of statement. The prenuptial clause on page 9, the intellectual property language, was this language explained to you before you signed the original agreement? No, Celeste said. Did you have independent counsel? She paused. No, I trusted. She stopped. No. Stephanie wrote something down. The IP clause, Garrett said. That's standard language. My attorney. Your attorney is Richard Ashford, Stephanie said without looking up, of Ashford Mills and Crane. She wrote something else, as in Blythe Ashford. Garrett went very still. Her brother, Stephanie said almost gently, which would make the preparation of these documents, including their timing, their terms, and the IP language specifically, a matter of some interest. She finally looked up. Don't you think? Celeste had not known that. She absorbed it in real time, that additional layer that the attorney who had drafted the documents designed to strip her of her independence was the brother of the woman her husband had been sleeping with for 8 months. That it was not just a betrayal of love. It was a coordinated dismantling planned from multiple directions designed to leave her with nothing. She sat with that for 3 full seconds. Then she said, I want primary custody, full creative ownership of every piece of work I've produced, and I want him out of this apartment by Friday. Harrison looked at his daughter with an expression she had seen before, too, not surprise, but satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of a man who has raised someone well and is watching the evidence of it. "We can do that," Stephanie said. Garrett's composure had broken down into something she didn't have a word for. Not quite anger, not quite panic, something between them that made him look like a stranger. "You can't just, this is still a legal process, you can't just—" "You brought a check for $30,000, Celeste said. She was calm. She was completely calm, in a way that came from somewhere deeper than composure, somewhere that felt solid and old. "You told me to disappear. You had an attorney who is related to your girlfriend draft documents to take my work." She looked at him. "Did you think I was going to sign them?" He didn't answer. "Did you think," she said quietly, "that you knew who you were dealing with?" He looked at her, then really looked at her, maybe for the first time all evening in a way that made her think he was finally asking himself the question he should have asked years ago. She held his gaze and let him look because she had nothing to hide. She had never had anything to hide. She was Celeste Mercer. She was Harrison's daughter. She was Eleanor's mother. She was 30 years old, and she had built a career and a reputation and a self that belonged entirely to her. And no amount of coordinated legal maneuvering and champagne and pre-drafted documents was going to reduce her to a number on a check. She reached across the table and picked up the divorce papers. She held them for a moment, 12 pages, all the careful planning and calculated cruelty that had gone into them, and then she handed them to Stephanie. "Find everything," she said. Stephanie nodded once. She was already writing. Stephanie Cho worked quietly, and she worked fast. Within 20 minutes of sitting down at Celeste's kitchen table with the divorce papers and her yellow legal pad, she had filled 4 pages of notes, flagged 9 separate clauses with small adhesive tabs she produced from her blazer pocket, and made 2 phone calls in a low voice that Celeste could not hear, but whose tone communicated everything the particular efficiency of a woman who has been in rooms like this before and knows exactly what needs to happen next. Garrett had not moved from his chair. He had texted someone Celeste assumed Richard Ashford still waiting in the lobby, and then sat with his phone face down on the table, which she knew from 3 years of living with him was what he did when he was thinking hard and not winning. Harrison sat across from his daughter and did not try to fill the silence. That was something she had always loved about him, his understanding that some moments needed to breathe, that not everything required managing. He poured her a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter. He set it in front of her without comment. She drank it. "Eat something," he said after a while. "I'm not hungry." "You're 8 months pregnant." "I know how pregnant I am, Dad." He almost smiled. "There's a restaurant on the corner. Marcus can go." "I'm not eating restaurant food at 8:30 on a Tuesday night." "You ate restaurant food at 9:30 on a Wednesday when you were studying for your MFA finals, and you called me to complain about it." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has kept 21 years of small memories and has no intention of apologizing for it. She felt something loosen very slightly in her chest. "There's pasta on the stove," she said. "It's probably cold. Cold pasta is fine." He got up and found a bowl without asking where the bowls were, which meant he had been in this kitchen before she had had him over twice in the last year, both times when Garrett was traveling, both times sitting exactly where Garrett was sitting now, talking about her work and Eleanor's nursery colors and the novel she had been writing in the margins of her design career. Harrison had never said anything about the fact that she only seemed to invite him when Garrett was away. He had filed it, she understood now, and waited. Garrett watched Harrison move around the kitchen with an expression that was difficult to read. "You've been here before," he said. "Yes," Harrison said. "Celeste never mentioned that." "No," Harrison agreed. "Why not?" Harrison set a bowl of cold pasta on the table in front of Celeste and looked at Garrett with something close to patience. I imagine because she was keeping the parts of her life that mattered to her separate from the parts that had become complicated. He sat back down. "That's something she learned from me. I'm not sure it always serves her well, but in this particular case, I think it was wise." Garrett absorbed this. "She never told me who she was," he said. And there was something in his voice that surprised Celeste, not anger exactly, but a kind of bewildered injury, as if he had found something to feel wronged about. 3 years. She was my wife. She never told me." She told you everything about who she was, Celeste said, before Harrison could respond. She told you she was a designer. She told you she had a father she was close to. She told you about her mother dying when she was 9. She told you she wanted children and a real home and a partner who chose her every day. She looked at him directly. The only thing she didn't tell you was whose name was on her birth certificate. And that wouldn't have mattered, Garrett, if everything else had been true. He was quiet. But you made it matter, she said, because you looked at her and saw someone without resources, someone alone, someone you could manage, and you planned accordingly. He shook his head. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? He didn't have an answer, because the answer Celeste knew was not one clean thing. It was 100 small decisions accumulated over years. The subtle way he had discouraged her from accepting that agency partnership offer, the way he had managed her social relationships until most of her old friends had drifted away, the way he had framed her independence as stubbornness and her privacy as secrecy. None of it was a villain's monologue. It was quieter and more ordinary than that, which was almost worse. Stephanie looked up from the papers. "I need to ask you something," she said to Celeste. "The IP clause. Your design portfolio, is any of it currently generating licensing revenue?" "Yes. I have 4 ongoing licensing agreements." "Under your professional name?" "Under my name, yes." "Not Mercer. I work as Celeste Ward." Her mother's maiden name, something that was hers alone, that had nothing to do with Harrison's money or Garrett's name, just hers. "I've worked under that name since before I met him." Stephanie wrote something down. The clause as written could be interpreted to include licensing revenue from work produced during the marriage. That's the argument his attorney would make. She looked at Garrett briefly without warmth. It's not a winning argument, but it would be a costly one to defend. "How costly?" Harrison asked. "Time mostly. Discovery would be extensive. They'd want to depose her clients, pull her financial records for the last 3 years. Stephanie set her pen down. "It's designed to be expensive, not to win, to exhaust." Celeste understood immediately what that meant, that the legal strategy had never been about fair division. It had been about attrition, about making her too tired and too broke and too new to motherhood to fight back effectively, about the $30,000 being not an offer, but a door here. Take this, stop fighting, walk away, because the alternative is years of your life spent in depositions instead of raising your daughter. "That's why you timed it now," she said to Garrett. "Isn't it? Not just because I was vulnerable emotionally, because you thought I couldn't afford a fight, financially or otherwise." He didn't deny it. "He thought," Harrison said quietly, "that you were alone." A silence settled, and in it Garrett looked at his father-in-law and his wife and Stephanie with her 4 pages of notes, and Marcus near the door, and some final version of his composure came apart around the edges. He pushed back from the table slightly. He ran a hand over his face. I didn't want it to go like this." "Then how did you want it to go?" Celeste asked. "I wanted it to be clean." "You keep using that word." "I wanted it to be over without this." He gestured broadly, vaguely at the room, at Harrison, at all of it. "I wanted you to take the settlement and let it be done." "And Blythe," Celeste said. "What did Blythe want?" He looked at the table. "Did she know about me? Did she know I was pregnant when this started?" Silence. "Garrett." "Yes," he said. "She knew." It was not a surprise. She had already assembled enough to know the shape of it, but hearing it confirmed had a weight that knowledge alone hadn't quite carried, the understanding that there was another woman who had looked at her situation and decided it was acceptable, that her pregnancy was not a reason to stop, but simply a fact to work around. She held that for a moment and let it hurt because it deserved to hurt, and then she set it down. "Stephanie," she said, "what do we have?" Stephanie turned her legal pad so Celeste could see it. The 9 flagged clauses, the notes in her precise, small handwriting. 3 issues with the prenuptial agreement alone: inadequate independent counsel disclosure, potentially coercive timing, and ambiguous asset language that wasn't adequately explained at signing. The IP clause is aggressive and arguably unenforceable given the circumstances. The custody language is vague in ways that favor him now, but could be rewritten to favor you significantly. She paused. "And then there's the Ashford connection." "The brother," Harrison said. Richard Ashford drafted these documents. His firm's name is on the header. His sister is the reason for the divorce. Stephanie looked at Garrett with professional neutrality. That is a conflict of interest. It may not invalidate the documents entirely, but it complicates the process considerably for your side. Any judge looking at this timeline when the affair started, when the documents were drafted, when the timing was chosen, is going to have questions. Garrett's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it. He didn't answer. "Richard?" Celeste asked. He nodded. "You should probably tell him the situation has changed," she said. Garrett looked at her, really looked at her in the way he had in the kitchen before her father arrived, that stripped-back version of him with the performance gone. "What is it you want Celeste to tell me? Not through attorneys. Just tell me." It was, she thought, possibly the most honest question he had asked her in 2 years. And so she answered it honestly. "I want primary custody of Eleanor," she said. "I want my work protected in full. I want this apartment until she's born, and I've had time to make other arrangements. I want a fair division of what we actually built together, and nothing more than that." She paused. "And I want Blythe Ashford to not be in my daughter's life for the first 3 years. I don't care what you do after that, but for the first 3 years she doesn't meet Eleanor." Garrett sat with that. The last part is non-negotiable. Courts don't generally. "I'm not asking a court," she said. "I'm asking you, as Eleanor's father, as someone who is going to have to live with the decisions he's made tonight for the rest of his life." She looked at him steadily. "Can you do that?" A long silence, the longest of the night. "Yes," he said. Harrison across the table was very still. Stephanie wrote something down. Marcus near the door shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, which was for Marcus the equivalent of a standing ovation. Garrett picked up his phone and called Richard. "Come up," he said, "and bring your conflict of interest disclosure form. We need to talk about whether you can still represent me on this." A pause. "No, I'm serious. Come up." He hung up. "He drafted them 4 months ago," Garrett said unprompted, looking at the table. "I didn't ask him to. He offered. He said it would be cleaner to have everything ready." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I knew it was a conflict. I let it happen anyway." "Why?" Celeste asked. "Because it was easier than finding someone who didn't know either of us. Because Richard knew the whole situation already, and I didn't want to explain it to someone new." He shook his head. "Because I was a coward." It was the second honest thing he had said all evening. Stephanie was already on her phone, and Celeste caught enough of the conversation to understand she was speaking to a family law partner at her firm, who was apparently available at 8:45 on a Tuesday night, because this was the kind of firm where people were always available. She was outlining the IP conflict, the custody language, the prenuptial disclosure issues, and the Ashford connection in precise sequential order. She sounded as she always sounded, like someone who had already won and was simply completing the paperwork. Harrison stood up. He came around the table to his daughter's side and stood beside her chair, not hovering, just present, that particular physical closeness that he'd always had with her, the kind that said, "I am here," without requiring any words at all. "How are you feeling?" he said quietly. "Tired," she said. And then more honestly, "Like I've been living in a house that was on fire for 8 months and just noticed." "You noticed before tonight," he said. She looked up at him. "You texted me 3 weeks ago," he said. "You didn't say anything specific. You just said, 'Do you remember what you said?'" She remembered. She had been sitting in the nursery she'd been putting together alone, painting the baseboard a pale sage green at 10 o'clock on a Saturday, because Garrett had said he'd do it and hadn't, and she had taken a photo of the half-finished wall and sent it to her father with the caption, "I think I've been making myself smaller for someone who doesn't deserve the space." "You said I was right," she said. "I said you were always right," he said. "You just needed to catch up to yourself." The elevator opened down the hall. Footsteps again, one set this time measured and slightly reluctant. Richard Ashford came through the open door and stopped. He was younger than Celeste had expected, late 30s, dark-haired with Blythe's same precise features in a masculine key. He looked at the room, at Harrison, at Stephanie, and something moved across his face that she could not name. "Mr. Ashford," Stephanie said. She had not stood up. She looked up from her legal pad with the expression of someone who has been waiting for exactly this. "Have a seat." He sat, slowly. "I want to talk about the IP clause on page 9, she said, "and then I want to talk about your disclosure obligations, and then I'd like your honest assessment of whether you believe you can continue to represent Mr. Hollis in this matter, given your familial relationship with the co-respondent." Richard opened his mouth. "Before you answer," Stephanie said, "I want you to know that I've already spoken to the family law division of my firm, and they have a different view of your drafting timeline than I suspect you do, so I'd encourage you to be precise." Another silence. This one different from the others. This one with the particular quality of a room in which the ground has finished shifting, and everyone is assessing the new landscape. Richard Ashford looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at the table. "The clause was drafted at my sister's suggestion," Richard said finally. "She had concerns about exposure, about what might complicate things if the situation became contested." "What situation?" Stephanie said. He hesitated. "The pregnancy." She was concerned, Stephanie said carefully, that the pregnancy would complicate a contested divorce, and so she asked you to draft language specifically designed to limit Celeste's financial independence. Richard did not answer. "Her brother," Harrison said from beside Celeste's chair. His voice was very quiet. "Your sister looked at my daughter 8 months pregnant and asked you to draft documents designed to make sure she had nothing to fight back with." He was not raising his voice. He never raised his voice, which somehow made it more. "And you did it." "I was trying to protect Blythe's interests." "You were trying to take my daughter's work," Harrison said. "What she built herself, before Garrett, before any of this, what she earned." The room was silent for a very long moment. Then Celeste said, "Richard, I'd like you to withdraw from this matter." He looked at her. "I'm not going to make a complaint to the bar, not tonight. That decision is still available to me, and I'll make it later when I've had time to think clearly." She held his gaze. "But I want you to withdraw, and I want to do it in writing, and I want it done before you leave this apartment." He looked at Garrett. Garrett nodded. "Once." Richard Ashford pulled out his phone and drafted a short email to his firm. He read it aloud, "Withdrawal from representation. Conflict of interest effective immediately," and sent it while Stephanie watched. She asked him to forward it to her. He did. He left without saying anything else. The apartment felt different after that. Quieter in a different register, the way a room feels when the last uncertain element has resolved itself. Celeste pressed her hands against the table and breathed slowly. Eleanor turned inside her a long, slow arc of movement, an elbow or a knee pressing outward and then releasing. It was the most present she had felt all evening, the most real. "Okay," Celeste said. She looked at Stephanie. "What's our next step?" "I file a response to the prenuptial challenge this week. We request a temporary custody order in your favor, pending full proceedings. We document the IP ownership with your existing client contracts and working files." Stephanie had already closed her legal pad and was back on her phone. "We're in a strong position." "How strong?" Stephanie looked up. For the first time all evening, something close to warmth crossed her face. "Very." Celeste nodded. She looked at Garrett across the table. He was exhausted. She could see that clearly now, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something he shouldn't have been carrying and has finally set it down, even if setting it down was not his choice. She did not feel sorry for him, but she recognized his humanity, which was different from sympathy and more sustainable. "You need to find another attorney," she said. "A good one. Someone who isn't connected to Blythe, someone who will actually tell you what your position is and not what she wants it to be." He looked at her. "Why are you helping me?" "Because Eleanor needs a father who's making clear decisions," she said. "Not one who's being managed by other people's agendas. If you want to be her father, actually be her father, then you need to start making your own choices." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I am sorry," he said. "For tonight, for all of it. I know that's not enough." "No," she said. "It's not, but it's a start." Harrison put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. She reached up and covered it with hers without thinking, and they stayed like that for a moment, the kind of moment that doesn't need language because language would only make it smaller. Stephanie gathered the papers and her legal pad and her 4 pages of notes. Marcus moved toward the door. Harrison said something low to Stephanie about next steps, and Celeste let their voices become background noise for a moment while she sat with what had happened in the last 2 hours. The hotel receipt had been in her pocket since that afternoon. She reached in now and took it out. She looked at it one more time, $642, October 14th. The date she had gone to her prenatal appointment alone and driven herself home and made dinner and waited. She set it on the table. She was done waiting. She stood up slowly, one hand on the table for balance, her body carrying its whole weight and Eleanor's. She was 30 years old and 8 months pregnant, and her marriage was over and her work was safe, and her father was in her kitchen, and tomorrow was going to be long and hard, and the day after that would be too. But tonight she had stayed calm. Tonight she had read every page. Tonight she had not let fear make her small. She picked up her phone and called the one person she hadn't called yet, her oldest friend Dana, who lived 4 blocks away and had never trusted Garrett and had said so once carefully 2 years ago and had never said it again because Celeste had not been ready to hear it. "It's me," she said when Dana picked up. "I need you to come over. Are you okay?" Dana's voice was immediately awake, immediately sharp with concern. "I will be," Celeste said, "but I need someone to help me pack some of his things." A beat. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Celeste set the phone down. She looked at the apartment. Her apartment with the kitchen table she'd chosen in Brooklyn, and the pale walls she'd painted herself, and the half-finished nursery down the hall with the sage-green baseboard she'd painted alone on a Saturday night when she had already somewhere beneath her conscious mind known. She walked down the hall to the nursery. She stood in the doorway and put her hand on the wall on the soft green she had chosen because it reminded her of something growing. "Hey, Eleanor," she said quietly, "we're going to be okay." And she meant it. For the first time all night, she meant it without reservation. Dana arrived in 9 minutes, not 10. She came through the door with her coat half-buttoned and her keys still in her hand, and one look at Celeste's face that lasted about 2 seconds before she crossed the room and pulled her into the kind of hug that doesn't ask permission. Dana Reyes was 32, small and fierce, in the way of someone who has had to be with dark hair she kept short, and a directness that had intimidated people Celeste knew and comforted her consistently for 11 years. "Tell me everything," Dana said. So Celeste told her. Standing in the kitchen, eating the cold pasta her father had served her, she went through it again, the receipt, the confession, Dorothea and the champagne, the papers, the $30,000, the word disappear. Harrison arriving, Richard Ashford's conflict of interest, his withdrawal. Garrett sitting at the table, looking like a man watching his own house burn down from the inside. Dana listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, which meant she understood the weight of it. When Celeste finished, Dana said, "Where is he now?" "Garrett guest room. He's leaving in the morning." "And your father?" "He went back to his hotel. He'll be here at 9. Celeste set the bowl down. "Stephanie is filing the temporary custody request first thing tomorrow." Dana nodded slowly. She was processing which for Dana looked like very deliberate stillness. Then she said, "You knew, didn't you, before tonight? Something." Celeste was quiet for a moment. "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what." "You called me 6 weeks ago," Dana said. 2 in the morning. You said you felt like a guest in your own life." "I remember." "I almost came over then." "I know, I told you not to." "You were wrong," Dana said without heat. Just simply, "You were wrong and I should have come anyway." Celeste looked at her. "You came now." 9 minutes, Dana said, which was both an answer and an apology, and a promise all at once. They spent the next hour doing something that felt both mundane and enormous going through the apartment, identifying what was Garrett's, what was hers, what was theirs together, and would need to be divided later. It was a strange archaeology of a marriage pulling apart the accumulated physical evidence of 3 years. His books on the second shelf. Her books on the first. The kitchen stand mixer they'd bought together in the first year, which neither of them had used more than twice. The photograph on the hallway wall of their wedding that Celeste had always slightly loved, and that now felt like looking at a document in a language she no longer spoke. She left the photograph. She wasn't ready to take it down, and taking it down felt like a decision that deserved more than tonight. Dana filled 2 boxes with things from the guest closet and the bathroom shelf things that were clearly, unambiguously Garrett's, that had no competing claim. She stacked them neatly by the front door. She did not make a single comment about any of it, which was Celeste thought the most loving thing she could have done. At 11:15, Eleanor kicked so hard that Celeste had to stop and press her hand against her side. "Hey," Dana said immediately. She was across the room in 3 steps. "What's happening?" "Contraction." "No, just active." Celeste breathed through it, though there was nothing to breathe through, really just the insistent physical reality of a baby who was running out of room and making her displeasure known. "She does this around 11. I think she's nocturnal." Dana put her hand beside Celeste's lightly over Eleanor's movement. She felt it a rolling press, a heel or a fist, something definite and alive. Dana's face did something soft and complicated. "She's so real," she said. "She is very real," Celeste agreed. "She has no idea what tonight was." "No." Celeste looked down at her own hands at the wedding ring she was still wearing, because she had not decided yet, because that too felt like a decision that deserved more than tonight. "And I'm glad. I want the first thing she knows to be the good part." Dana squeezed her hand once. Then, because she was Dana, "I never liked him." "I know. I told you, 2 years ago. I know Dana. I said he looks at you like you're something he acquired, like a very nice apartment he got a good deal on." "I remember." Celeste almost laughed, which surprised her. "You said it exactly like that." "I'm sorry I was right. I'm sorry I wasn't ready to hear it." Dana looked at her for a moment. "You're ready now." "Yes," Celeste said. "I am." At 11:43, the guest room door opened. Garrett came out with his phone and stood at the edge of the hallway. He looked at the 2 boxes by the door. He looked at Dana, who looked back at him with the particular expression of a small woman who is not afraid of anything and wants that to be clear. He looked at Celeste. "I have a hotel," he said. "I can go tonight if you want." Celeste considered. Part of her wanted him gone immediately, wanted the space of the apartment to be hers, without the weight of his presence. But another part, the part that was still going to have to co-parent this child for the next 18 years, understood that how this began would shape how it continued. "Tomorrow morning is fine," she said. "By 9. He nodded. He looked at the boxes. "Those are mine. Things from the guest closet and bathroom." He bent and opened the top of one box, looked through it briefly. He pulled out a small framed photograph and held it. She couldn't see which one from across the room. He set it back in the box. "I'm going to find a new attorney," he said. "Someone not connected to any of this." "Good. I want to be in the delivery room," he said. "If you'll let me. I know I have no right to ask, but I want to be there." The room was very quiet. "I'll think about it," Celeste said. That was more than he'd expected. She could tell by the way his shoulders changed. "Okay," he said. "That's okay, thank you." He went back to the guest room and closed the door. Dana looked at Celeste. She did not say anything. She didn't have to. "Eleanor needs a father who shows up," Celeste said, "even if he's a terrible husband. Those are different jobs." "Yeah," Dana said. "They are." Celeste sat down on the couch and let herself be still for a moment. The apartment was quiet. The boxes were by the door. The divorce papers were at Stephanie's firm, and tomorrow there would be filings and calls and 100 practical decisions to make. But right now, it was almost midnight, and she was 30 years old and tired in every part of herself, and her daughter was doing slow circles inside her, and she had survived this day. She took off her wedding ring. She held it in her palm for a moment, the simple oval diamond chosen to last. It had lasted 3 years, which was not nothing. But it was done. She set it on the coffee table and looked at it, and then she stopped looking at it, and that was that. Dana sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, the city went on being itself. "Stay tonight?" Celeste asked. "Already texted my neighbor to feed the cat," Dana said. 3 weeks later, Eleanor came 6 days early. Not dramatically, not in the way that stories sometimes manufacture urgency for effect. She came the way most things that matter come at an inconvenient time and with less ceremony than expected. Celeste was on a call with Stephanie about the asset division when her water broke, which was so perfectly timed to the general chaos of her life that she had to stop and acknowledge the irony for about 4 seconds before Dana, who was working at the kitchen table beside her, grabbed her hospital bag from the closet with a speed that suggested she had been rehearsing this. "Tell Stephanie we'll call her back," Dana said. "Stephanie," Celeste said into the phone, "I'm going to need to—" "I heard," Stephanie said. "Go. Call me when you're settled. Congratulations, Celeste." Harrison met them at the hospital in 22 minutes, which was not possible given the traffic between his hotel and the hospital, which meant he had left before she called him, which meant he had been waiting for this call every day for the last week. She did not ask him about this. She just held his hand in the waiting room while they prepped her, and he held hers back, and that was enough. Garrett arrived 40 minutes later. He came in quietly, without Blythe, without anyone, just himself, in the same coat he'd been wearing the night of the hotel receipt, which seemed like a detail the universe had decided was necessary. He sat in the waiting room across from Harrison, and Harrison looked at him once and then looked away, and they did not speak, but they were both there. For Eleanor. Which was the point. Celeste's labor was 11 hours. She would describe it later to Dana as the second hardest thing she had ever done, the first being the last 3 years. She was not entirely joking. Eleanor Rose Mercer was born at 6:47 in the morning, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with her grandfather's stubborn jaw and her mother's dark eyes and a voice that announced her arrival with absolute authority. Celeste held her and cried, not the held-together kind of crying she had been doing for weeks, the kind that happens behind closed eyes when you think no one can see, but the full, open kind, the kind that doesn't care who's watching. She cried and held this small, extraordinary person against her chest and said very quietly, "Hi, Eleanor. I'm your mom." Harrison came in when the nurses invited him. He stood at the side of the bed and looked at his granddaughter with an expression Celeste had never seen on his face, before something unguarded and vast, like standing at the edge of something you cannot measure. He touched Eleanor's hand with one finger, very gently, and Eleanor's hand closed around it, which is something newborns do reflexively, but which Harrison experienced as the most deliberate and consequential thing that had ever happened to him. "She's got your mother's hands," he said very quietly. Celeste looked at her daughter's hands. She hadn't known that. She hadn't had enough of her mother to have those kinds of reference points. "Tell me what you mean," she said. So Harrison, standing in a hospital room at 7 in the morning, holding his granddaughter's finger, described his late wife's hands, the long fingers, the particular way she held things, the habit she had of pressing her palm flat against whatever she was thinking about, as if understanding required touch. He had not talked about Celeste's mother in years in this kind of detail, and Celeste let him talk and listened to every word and stored it somewhere permanent. Garrett was allowed in briefly. He stood at a careful distance and looked at Eleanor with an expression Celeste could not fully interpret, complicated, layered the expression of a man reckoning with consequence in real time. He said, "She's beautiful," which was true. He said, "Thank you for letting me be here," which cost him something. She could hear it. "She's your daughter too," Celeste said. "That doesn't change because we changed." He nodded. He didn't trust himself to say more, which was possibly the most emotionally intelligent thing he had done in the last month. The legal proceedings took 4 months. Stephanie was, as promised, formidable. The prenuptial challenge succeeded on the grounds of inadequate independent counsel disclosure. Celeste had signed it without her own attorney present, which under current case law was sufficient to render several of its more aggressive provisions unenforceable. The IP clause was struck entirely. Celeste retained full ownership of her design portfolio, her client contracts, her licensing revenue, and every piece of creative work she had produced during the marriage and before it. Primary physical custody went to Celeste, with Garrett having scheduled parenting time that expanded as Eleanor got older and as he demonstrated consistently over time, not in a single gesture, but in accumulated reliable presence, that he was someone his daughter could count on. The apartment was hers until Eleanor's second birthday, at which point the equity would be divided fairly. Everything else was split according to what they had actually contributed, which was, when stripped of the aggressive prenuptial language, fairly clear. Blythe Ashford was not in Eleanor's life for the first 3 years. Garrett had agreed to this in writing, which Stephanie had documented thoroughly, and he kept the agreement. Celeste did not know whether this was because he had developed a conscience or because he understood that violating it would cost him significantly more than it gained him. She decided that for Eleanor's sake, the reason mattered less than the result. Richard Ashford was the subject of a bar complaint filed 6 weeks after the proceedings concluded. It was not Celeste who filed it. It was Stephanie acting on evidence gathered during discovery that suggested the IP clause had been specifically designed around language from Blythe Ashford's conversations with her brother, personal knowledge about Celeste's design business that Blythe had acquired through Garrett and passed to Richard for use in the documents. It was a cleaner case than expected. The bar agreed. Dorothea Hollis called once in February, 4 months after Eleanor was born. Celeste answered because she had decided after a great deal of consideration that not answering would be its own kind of ongoing engagement, the kind where you spend energy managing an avoidance. Better to answer, better to be done. "I want to apologize," Dorothea said. Celeste waited. "The champagne was wrong," Dorothea said. "I have thought about it many times, and I want you to know I understand that it was wrong." Celeste considered the careful limitation of that apology, not the papers, not the timing, not the $30,000, not the word disappear, but the champagne, the most visible symbol reduced to a stand-in for everything else. She noted this without anger. Dorothea was a woman who had built her life around managing appearances, and this was perhaps the truest apology she was capable of giving. "I appreciate that," Celeste said. "I would like to know my granddaughter," Dorothea said. "That depends on Garrett," Celeste said. "That's his relationship to manage. I won't obstruct it, but I won't facilitate it either. If you want to know Eleanor, talk to her father." A pause. "That's fair," Dorothea said. "Yes," Celeste said. "It is." She ended the call and sat for a moment with her phone in her hand, listening to Eleanor in the next room. That particular sound of a baby discovering that her own hands exist a kind of quiet, delighted investigation. She set the phone down and went to her daughter. In March, Celeste published her novel. She had been writing it for 4 years in the early mornings, before the apartment woke up on her phone during Garrett's business trips on Saturday afternoons, when she told him she was catching up on client work and was instead building something entirely her own. It was not autobiographical exactly, but it was hers in every sense that mattered. Her voice, her observations, her understanding of the way quiet people are underestimated, and what happens when they decide to stop accommodating that. She published it under Celeste Ward. She did not tell her father until it was out because she had needed this one thing to land or not land on its own. She sent him a copy with a note that said simply, "I wrote this during the years I was making myself smaller. I think it's the best thing I've done." He called her 20 minutes after the package arrived. She did not answer because Eleanor was sleeping and the phone was across the room. He left a voicemail that she saved and would listen to many times in the years after Celeste. "I finished the first chapter. I need you to know that whatever I've built and whatever my name is worth, none of it compares to what you just did. This is yours, all of it. I'm so proud of you I don't have the words for it," which is something I never thought I'd say because I always have the words. "Call me when she's awake. I love you." She sat on the floor of the nursery with her back against the wall and Eleanor in her lap and played the voicemail 3 times. The novel did well. Not explosively, not overnight. It built the way good things build, through word of mouth and genuine response, one reader telling another. By summer, it had found its audience, which turned out to be wider than she'd imagined. Women who recognized something in the quiet protagonist, who had spent time making themselves smaller and were in various stages of deciding to stop. She read their letters and their reviews and their social media posts with the particular feeling of someone who wrote something private and discovered it was also public in the most meaningful way. She did interviews under Celeste Ward. She did not correct people who didn't know her last name or her father's name. She did not hide it if they asked she was done hiding. But she did not lead with it because the work was the work and it stood on what it was. Harrison came to her first bookstore event in April. He sat in the third row in a dark sweater with his security team positioned unobtrusively near the exits. And when she read the chapter she had been most afraid to read aloud, the one about a woman discovering that the love she'd thought was protecting her had actually been containing her. She looked up from the page at one point and found his face in the audience. He was not crying. Harrison Mercer did not cry in public. But his expression was something she had seen only a few times in her life, in the most private moments, open, unguarded, entirely without performance. He was looking at his daughter the way you look at something that humbles you. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, and then looked back at the page and kept reading. After the event, when the signing line had cleared and the bookstore was quieting, he came to find her. He stood beside her while she packed the remaining copies into a bag, and he waited until she was done, and then he said, "I want to tell you something." "Okay," she said. "I spent a long time," he said, "worrying about whether I gave you enough, after your mother. Whether what I built was the right thing to give you, or whether it was going to be a weight you spent your life carrying." He looked at her. "I know now that it wasn't. You carried it just fine. You put it down when you needed to, and you picked it up when it was useful, and you built something that had nothing to do with it." He paused. "I wanted you to know I see that." Celeste stood with her bag of books and her father's words and the quiet of the bookstore around her, and let herself feel fully, and without shortening it, what it meant to be seen by the person who had known you longest. "I learned from you," she said. "You improved on what I taught you," he said. "That's the right order." Eleanor was asleep in her stroller beside the signing table, one fist pressed against her cheek, in the determined way she had of sleeping, as if rest was something she had decided to commit to completely. Celeste looked at her daughter and thought about what she had said to her in the nursery on the night of the receipt, and the champagne and the divorce papers, and the 12 minutes were going to be okay. She had meant it then as a declaration of intent, a promise she was making to both of them. She knew now, in the quiet of a bookstore in April, with her novel stacked on a table and her father beside her and her daughter asleep in her stroller, that it had also been simply true. Not because the hard part was over, it wasn't, not entirely. Co-parenting was its own ongoing negotiation. The legal proceedings had taken things out of her that would take time to restore. There were still mornings when she woke up and felt the shape of the loss before she remembered everything that had come after it. But she was standing. She was working. She was raising Eleanor in an apartment that felt like hers. Actually hers, not a performance of domesticity for someone else's comfort, and writing under her own name, and answering to no one's version of her except the one she had built herself. She had made herself small for 5 years. She would not make that mistake again. Not for love, not for fear, not for the false comfort of being easier to manage. Eleanor was watching even now in the particular way that babies watch, not with understanding, but with absorption, taking in everything, building the template for what a woman looks like when she lives fully in herself. Celeste was going to give her daughter the best possible template. She reached into the stroller and adjusted Eleanor's blanket, which had slipped slightly. Eleanor's fist uncurled briefly, and her fingers spread wide, those long fingers Harrison had said your mother's hands, and then curled back. "Come on," Celeste said to her father. "Let's get dinner." "Somewhere good?" he said. "Somewhere that has pasta," she said. "I've been craving it since October." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh like that in a long time, unguarded, genuine, the laugh of a man who is simply happy in a moment. She filed it away in the same place she kept the voicemail and Eleanor's hands and the sage-green baseboard and everything else that was hers to keep. She pushed the stroller toward the door. Harrison held it open, and Celeste Mercer walked out into the April evening as exactly who she was. Nothing added, nothing subtracted, nobody's smaller version of herself. The dinner Harrison had promised turned into something longer than either of them planned. They found a small Italian place 2 blocks from the bookstore, the kind with paper tablecloths and candles and wine bottles, and a host who took one look at the stroller and found them a corner table without being asked. Eleanor slept through the breadbasket and most of the appetizers, which Celeste took as a personal endorsement of the restaurant's noise level. Harrison ordered the pasta. Celeste ordered the pasta. They sat across from each other in the particular ease of two people who have been through something together and come out the other side still standing, and for the first 20 minutes they talked about nothing important at all. Eleanor's sleeping habits, a renovation Harrison was overseeing at a building in Seattle, a book he'd been reading on the flight in that he couldn't decide whether he liked. Then Harrison set down his fork and said, "I want to talk to you about the foundation." Celeste looked up. "I've been thinking about it since December," he said. "Since before Eleanor was born, actually. Since the night I came to your apartment and sat at your kitchen table and watched you read 12 pages of documents that were designed to take everything from you." He looked at her steadily. "There are women who don't have a Stephanie, who don't have someone in their corner with a legal pad and 11 years of experience, who sign the papers and take the $30,000 because they don't know they have another option." I know, Celeste said. "I want to do something about that, and I want you to run it." She was quiet. "Not because of my name," he said quickly, anticipating her. "Not because of the funding, though that's available. Because of what you know now. Because you sat in that apartment and you read every page and you didn't let fear make the decision for you. That is the thing that needs to be taught. That is what the women in those situations don't have access to, not just money, not just attorneys, but the knowledge that they are allowed to slow down, that they are allowed to read the page, that they do not have to sign tonight." Celeste pressed her hand flat against the table, the gesture she had apparently inherited from her mother without knowing it. She thought about the women she'd heard from since the novel came out, the letters, the reviews, the woman who had written 3 paragraphs about reading the chapter on containment and then calling her sister for the first time in 2 years, the woman who had said she dog-eared page 47 because it was the first time she had seen her own experience described in language she could show someone else. "What would it look like?" she said. "Legal aid partnerships," Harrison said. "Direct representation for women in high-conflict divorce proceedings who can't afford private counsel. A resource center, practical information about rights, about process, about what questions to ask, and an advocacy component. Because the laws in some states still allow exactly what Garrett's team attempted, and that should change." "The children component," Celeste said. He tilted his head. "Children from these families," she said. "The ones who grow up watching their parents fight over them like disputed assets. They need something too. Counseling resources, educational support, a way of understanding that what happened between their parents was not about them." She paused. "Eleanor is going to need that someday, in some form, and she has every advantage. Most of these kids don't." Harrison looked at his daughter across the candlelight. "Yes," he said. "That. I want to design it," she said. "Not just run it. I want to build it from the inside out the way I built my practice. Not take someone else's structure and put my name on it. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. And I want Dana involved. She's been doing nonprofit development consulting for 6 years. She knows how to build something that lasts. Done. And I'm not leaving my design work," she said. "The foundation is not a replacement. It's an addition." "I wouldn't ask you to leave it," he said. "The work you do matters independently. The novel matters. What you've built as Celeste Ward is real, and it's yours, and it should stay yours." She nodded slowly. Eleanor stirred in the stroller and made a small sound and settled again. Both of them looked at her for a moment. "She looks like she's solving something in her sleep," Harrison said. "She does that," Celeste said. "I think she's going to be stubborn." "Good," Harrison said. "Stubborn women know what they're worth." The foundation took 8 months to build properly. Celeste was meticulous about it in the way she was meticulous about design work, starting with the structure before the surface, understanding the load-bearing elements before choosing anything decorative. She spent the first 2 months in meetings with family law attorneys across 3 states, learning the specific pressure points in the system where women were most vulnerable and most likely to make decisions under duress that they would spend years undoing. She met with child psychologists and school counselors and a family court judge in New Jersey who had been on the bench for 19 years and had a great deal to say about what she saw and what she wished she could do about it. She met with women who had lived it, That was the part that changed her most. Not the legal education, not the structural conversations, not the policy research. The afternoon she spent listening to women who had sat where she had sat with worse resources and less time, and no one arriving in 12 minutes. Women who had signed, women who had taken the money and disappeared as instructed and spent years rebuilding from numbers that were never enough. Women who had watched their children navigate between households with the particular exhausted adaptability of kids who have learned that love is a thing that has scheduling and lawyers. She listened and she took notes, and she did not offer her own story unless they asked, because this was not about her story. But some of them recognized something in her face, something in the quality of her attention, and they asked. And when they asked, she told them the truth, the receipt, the papers, the champagne, the 12 minutes. She told it plainly and without performance, because the point was not the drama of it but the mechanics. The way she had slowed down, the way she had read every page, the way she had known even in the worst moment of it that she was allowed to take up space. Dana ran the operational side with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting her whole career for a project worth running. She built the intake process from scratch, the legal aid referral network, the children's program framework. She hired well and trained thoroughly and had the particular talent of making a room full of people feel both organized and trusted, which was rarer than most organizations understood. One afternoon in November, 8 months after the dinner at the Italian restaurant, Celeste sat across from a woman named Marielle in a small conference room at the Foundation's new offices. Marielle was 34, 7 months pregnant, and had come in with a manila envelope in her hands. Inside it were papers her husband had left on the kitchen counter that morning with a note that said, "Sign these." Celeste looked at the envelope. She looked at Marielle. "Did you sign them?" she asked. "Not yet," Marielle said. "My sister told me to come here first." "Good," Celeste said. "Your sister was right." She reached across the table and touched the edge of the envelope. "We're going to open these together, and we're going to read every page, and you're not going to sign anything today. Okay?" Marielle's eyes filled. She nodded. "Take a breath," Celeste said. "You have time. That's the first thing I want you to understand. Whatever they told you, whatever deadline they gave you, you have time." They sat together for 2 hours. Celeste walked her through every clause, every implication, every place where the language was designed to seem reasonable and wasn't. She called the legal aid attorney on their referral list, a woman named Christine who had handled 40 cases through the foundation in its first 6 months. And by the time Marielle left, she had an appointment, a plan, and the particular steadiness of someone who has just discovered that the situation is survivable. She also left the unsigned papers on the table. That night, Celeste sat in Eleanor's room after putting her to bed. Eleanor was 10 months old now, pulling herself upright against anything available, deeply committed to mobility and deeply unsteady, which was a combination that kept Celeste's heart rate elevated throughout most of the day. And she thought about Marielle's face when she realized she didn't have to sign. The specific quality of that relief, like something being set down that she hadn't known she was carrying. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. The knowledge that you were allowed to set it down. Eleanor stood up against the crib rail, wobbled significantly, and looked at her mother with an expression of absolute determination. "Careful," Celeste said. Eleanor sat down hard, considered the situation, and immediately tried again. Celeste watched her, this small, fierce person who approached every obstacle with the same methodology, attempt, fall, recalibrate, attempt again, and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have a precise word for. Not peace exactly, more like alignment. The feeling of being in the right place, doing the right thing in the right way. The novel had gone to a second printing in September. Celeste had done a longer interview for a literary magazine that fall, the first one, where she had answered the question about her background fully and without editing. Yes, Harrison Mercer's daughter. Yes, she had kept it private for years. Yes, here was why. The interviewer had expected the disclosure to be the story. It wasn't. The story was everything she'd built without it, and everything she'd learned when it stopped being enough to hide behind. She had expected some version of backlash, the accusation that her success was adjacently purchased, that the novel's reception was influenced by who her father was. It happened in the small and manageable way that most backlash happens when the work itself is solid. She addressed it once plainly in a short statement that said, "I published under a name that had nothing to do with my father. The work found its readers before they knew my last name. I am proud of both facts." She did not address it again. Harrison called on a Wednesday in December, a year and 2 months after the night of the hotel receipt. "I want to tell you something," he said, which was how he had begun a dozen significant conversations in her life, going back to the one where he told her her mother was sick, and the one where he told her she'd been accepted to the graduate program she'd applied to without telling him. "Okay," she said. "The foundation," he said. "I've been watching what you've built. Not monitoring, I want to be clear about the difference. Watching. From a distance. The numbers from the first year, the case outcomes, the children's program retention rates, the legislative testimony Dana gave in Trenton last month." He paused. "Celeste, do you know what you've done?" "We're just getting started," she said. 237 women, he said. In 1 year, 237 women who walked in with papers they'd been told to sign and walked out with representation and time and information. His voice was doing something careful, something deliberate, the way his voice got when he was feeling something he had decided to say out loud rather than manage. That's not just getting started. That is something real and large and yours. She was quiet for a moment. 241, she said. "We had 4 more this week." He was quiet too, and then he laughed the same unguarded laugh from the bookstore in April, the one she had filed away. 241, he said. "Of course you knew." Garrett called in January, Eleanor's first January, on a Thursday evening when he had dropped Eleanor back after his scheduled weekend. He handed Eleanor over at the door, Eleanor who had finally triumphantly taken her first fully unsupported steps 2 weeks earlier, and who now approached mobility as both her right and her religion, and then stood in the doorway in a way that suggested he wanted to say something. Celeste waited. "I've been seeing someone," he said. "Not Blythe, someone it doesn't matter who, but I wanted you to know, and I wanted you to hear it from me before Eleanor is old enough to ask questions." "Okay," she said. "I don't know if you care," he said. "I think you probably don't, but I wanted to handle this part right, whatever that means after everything." She looked at him in the doorway of the apartment she was leaving in 2 months, when the lease agreement reached its negotiated end and she had found a place of her own. Actually her own chosen entirely by her 3 blocks from Dana, with a second bedroom for Eleanor, and a third room she was calling the study, but which was also where she was writing the second novel. She looked at the man she had loved, and the man who had failed her, and the father of her daughter. All of them the same person, all of them standing in her doorway trying to say something true. "I do care," she said. "Not in the way I used to, but Eleanor cares about your life, even if she can't say so yet. So yes, I care because she does." He nodded. "That's fair. That's more than fair." "Is she good to you?" Celeste asked. "This person, is she honest with you?" He blinked. He had not expected that question. "Yes," he said. "I think so." "Good," she said. "Then be honest with her. All the way. Don't make the same mistakes." She shifted Eleanor to her other hip. Eleanor grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair with the satisfied confidence of someone claiming territory. "Eleanor's going to be watching you for the rest of your life. The way you treat the people you love is going to be one of the first lessons she learns about what love looks like." He absorbed this. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Think about her that clearly, even now." "Because she's the most important thing," Celeste said. "Everything else is just everything else." She looked at him steadily. "You can do it too. It's a choice you make every day." He nodded again. Something shifted in his face, some slow reckoning that she recognized as real rather than performed. "I'm sorry, Celeste," he said. "Not in the way I said it before. I mean it differently now. I know what I took from you. I know what I tried to take. And I'm sorry." She held his gaze for a moment. Eleanor yanked harder on her hair, which was Eleanor's way of noting that the conversation had gone on long enough and someone should be paying attention to her. "I know," Celeste said. "Good night, Garrett." She closed the door. Not harshly, just closed it. Then she looked at her daughter's face, that round, determined, searching face looking at her with the whole concentrated attention of a person who has not yet learned to divide herself. And she said, "What do you want for dinner?" Eleanor said, "Bah," which was not a word, but was delivered with such authority that Celeste took it as a complete sentence. The Foundation's first annual report was published in February. Celeste wrote the introduction herself, which she had insisted on over Dana's gentle suggestion that they hire a professional writer, and which she had drafted and revised 8 times over the course of a month before she was satisfied with it. It was 2 pages. It said what it meant to say, without saying more than that. It started with a question. What does a woman need in the worst moment to make a decision she won't spend the rest of her life undoing? And it answered that question across 2 pages with the specific, practical, unglamorous truth, not inspiration, not abstraction, but process. Time, information. Someone to sit across the table and say you don't have to sign tonight. You are allowed to read every page. You are allowed to take up space in this decision. The response to the report was larger than she anticipated. 3 other foundations reached out about partnership. 2 state legislators who had been working on family law reform contacted them about testimony. A journalist who covered women's legal issues wrote a long piece about the Foundation's model that was shared widely enough that Celeste's phone was full of notifications for 2 days, which she mostly ignored in favor of a meeting with Christine about their Q2 caseload. Harrison sent her the article with a 1-line text. "They finally noticed." She replied, "We were always here. They're just looking now." In March, she moved into the new apartment. Dana helped her carry boxes, which was a reversal of the night 11 months earlier, when Dana had filled boxes with Garrett's things and stacked them by the door. This time the boxes were Celeste's, her books, her work, Eleanor's things, the pieces of a life she had built and was continuing to build. Carried up 3 flights of stairs on a Saturday morning, with Dana providing a running commentary on box weight and Celeste laughing more than she had in longer than she could precisely calculate. Eleanor regarded the new apartment with the serious investigative attention she brought to all new spaces, pulling herself along the baseboards, pressing her hands against the walls, sitting in the middle of the living room floor, and taking a full assessment before deciding that it was acceptable. Then she found a patch of morning light on the floor and sat in it with the satisfied expression of someone who has located exactly what she was looking for. Celeste sat beside her. She looked at the empty walls that were waiting for her to decide what to put on them, at the windows and the light, and the particular promise of a space that was entirely, uncomplicatedly hers. She thought about the night she had found the hotel receipt, the 4 hours she had sat with it before Garrett came home, the way she had pressed her feet into the floor and kept her breathing even, and told herself, "Stay calm, read every page you have time." She thought about Dorothea and the champagne and the 12 minutes. She thought about Stephanie's yellow legal pad and the 4 pages of notes and Harrison's face when he walked through the door and looked at his daughter and said simply, "You okay?" She thought about Marielle, who had come in with the envelope and left without signing, and the 240 others, and the ones still coming. She thought about Eleanor, who was currently engaged in a detailed examination of her own fingers, with the focused intensity of a scientist who has discovered something genuinely interesting. She had spent 5 years making herself small for someone who was never going to be big enough to deserve it. She had spent the year since unlearning that smallness, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the daily accumulated decisions of a woman who has decided that she is done negotiating her own worth. Every morning she woke up and chose her work, her daughter, her foundation, her voice. Every morning she reminded herself, this is who you are, not your father's name, not your ex-husband's failure, not the worst night you ever had in your own kitchen, all of it and more. She was Celeste Mercer. She was Celeste Ward. She was Harrison's daughter and Eleanor's mother and Dana's best friend, and Stephanie's client turned colleague, and Marielle's reminder that you don't have to sign tonight. She was the woman who had read every page when it would have been easier to fall apart, who had said, "I'm not signing this tonight," with the quiet authority of someone who finally understood that authority was always hers to claim. She was 31 years old, and she was just beginning. Eleanor looked up from her fingers and found her mother's face and broke into the enormous, unguarded, full-body smile that she had developed sometime around month 9, and that still every single time hit Celeste somewhere so deep and fundamental that no other feeling could exist alongside it. "Hi," Celeste said. Eleanor said "bah" again and reached for her. Celeste picked her daughter up and held her in the morning light of the apartment that was theirs, and she felt not happiness exactly, though it was that too, but something more structural than happiness, something that would hold when happiness was harder to locate. She felt like herself, fully, finally, without reduction or apology. That was the thing she had been working toward. Not the legal victory, not the foundation, not the novel, or the second printing, or the article, or any of the external markers of a life reassembled. Those were real, and they mattered. But the thing underneath them, the thing that made them possible, and that would outlast all of them, was this: she knew who she was, and she had decided that knowing was enough. She had been made small. She had refused to stay that way. She had stood in her own kitchen on the worst night of her life and read every page, and that decision, that single, quiet, stubborn decision, had been the first step of everything that followed. She pressed her face against Eleanor's hair. Some women get knocked down and stay down. Some get knocked down and spend years getting back up slowly, carefully, with the particular caution of someone who is afraid of falling again. And some, the ones who know their worth even when they've forgotten it temporarily, the ones who find the receipt in the coat pocket and press their feet into the floor and breathe, get knocked down and come up standing, already moving, already building, already becoming the next and better version of who they were always meant to be. Celeste Mercer had been knocked down by the right person at exactly the right time to discover that she could not be kept there, and she never would be again.